Lisa walked through the glass doors of the Riverside Community Center on a rainy Thursday evening. Her old sneakers squeaked against the polished floor as she made her way down the hallway. Following the sound of piano music, she clutched a worn envelope containing 3 crumpled $20 bills, money she had saved from her tips at the local diner over the past 2 months. The community center smelled like coffee and old books. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a pale yellow glow. Lisa had driven past this building hundreds of times on her way to work, but never imagined she would actually walk through its doors. At 45 years old, she finally had enough money to do something she had dreamed about for decades. She found the music room at the end of the hallway. Through the small window in the door, she could see about 12 people sitting in folding chairs arranged in a semicircle. Most of them looked to be in their 60s or 70s, well-dressed with neat haircuts and expensive-looking purses and briefcases. Lisa looked down at her faded jeans and the sweater she had bought at a thrift store 3 years ago. Maybe this was a mistake, but she had come this far. She knocked gently on the door and stepped inside. The conversation stopped. 12 pairs of eyes turned to look at her. Lisa felt her cheeks get warm as she stood in the doorway, suddenly very aware of how different she looked from everyone else in the room. "Can I help you?" asked a tall man with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He was wearing a black suit that looked like it cost more than Lisa made in a month. His voice was crisp and formal, like a news anchor. "I'm here for the piano class," Lisa said quietly, "the beginner class." The man looked her up and down, his expression shifting from confusion to what looked like mild annoyance. "Are you sure you're in the right place? This is an adult education program." Lisa felt her face get even warmer. "Yes, I'm sure. I called last week and registered Lisa Martinez." The man checked his clipboard, running his finger down a list of names. "Ah, yes. Here you are." He didn't sound pleased about it. "I'm Professor Davidson. Welcome to classical piano for adult beginners." Lisa nodded and looked around the room for an empty chair. The only one available was in the back corner, which was fine with her. She preferred to stay out of the spotlight anyway. As she walked to her seat, she heard whispers and felt more eyes following her. "That's the new student," someone whispered, not very quietly. "She looks so young," another person said. "Wonder what her story is." Lisa sat down and placed her hands in her lap. Her palms were rough and calloused from years of washing dishes and wiping down tables. She worked 6 days a week at Mel's Diner, starting her shift at 5 in the morning and finishing around 3 in the afternoon. Most days, she was so tired when she got home that she could barely keep her eyes open long enough to eat dinner, but she had always dreamed of playing piano. Professor Davidson continued with what seemed to be the middle of a lecture about proper posture. "Remember, your back should be straight, shoulders relaxed. Think of a string pulling you up from the top of your head." He demonstrated at the upright piano in the front of the room. Lisa watched carefully, absorbing every word. She had been waiting for this opportunity for so long that she didn't want to miss a single detail. "Now, let's go around the room and have everyone introduce themselves," Professor Davidson said. "Tell us your name, what you do for work, and why you decided to take piano lessons." One by one, the other students shared their stories. There was Margaret, a retired bank president who had always wanted to learn piano but never had time during her career. Robert was a retired doctor whose wife had bought him lessons for his 70th birthday. Patricia owned 3 art galleries and thought piano would help her appreciate classical music better. Everyone had interesting careers and impressive accomplishments. They talked about their vacation homes and their grandchildren's college graduation ceremonies. They mentioned wine tastings and book clubs and charity events. Then it was Lisa's turn. "I'm Lisa," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I work at Mel's Diner downtown. I've always wanted to play piano since I was little, but I never had the chance before now." The room was quiet for a moment. Lisa could feel people exchanging glances, though she kept her eyes focused on her hands. "Well," Professor Davidson said, clearing his throat, "music is for everyone, I suppose. What kind of experience do you have with piano?" Lisa hesitated. How could she explain without going into details she wasn't ready to share? I played a little when I was young, she said finally, but I had to stop when I was 16. Family problems. Professor Davidson nodded curtly. Well, we'll start you with the basics. Can't assume anything, regardless of what people think they remember from childhood. The way he said it made Lisa feel small. She nodded and tried to smile. For the next hour, Professor Davidson demonstrated basic finger exercises and hand positions. He showed them how to sit properly at the piano bench and how to curve their fingers over the keys. Lisa paid attention to every word, even though much of what he was teaching felt familiar, like remembering a language she used to know. When it came time for students to try the exercises themselves, Professor Davidson had them take turns at the piano. Margaret went first, then Robert, then Patricia. Each person struggled with the coordination, but Professor Davidson was patient and encouraging. Very good, Margaret. You're getting the hang of it. Excellent progress, Robert. I can see you've been practicing. When it was Lisa's turn, she walked to the piano and sat on the bench. She adjusted her posture the way Professor Davidson had shown them and placed her hands over the keys. The exercise was simple, just playing C, D, F, G with the right hand, then back down, but the moment her fingers touched the keys, something magical happened. The notes came out clear and even, with perfect timing and just the right amount of pressure. Her fingers moved with a natural grace that made the simple exercise sound almost musical. The room went quiet. Lisa finished the exercise and looked up. Professor Davidson was staring at her with a puzzled expression. Have you been practicing? He asked. No, sir, Lisa said honestly. I don't have a piano at home. Professor Davidson frowned. Well, you must have some natural ability. But don't let it go to your head. Natural ability only gets you so far. Real piano playing requires years of disciplined study. Lisa nodded and returned to her seat. She could feel the other students looking at her with curiosity now, but Professor Davidson quickly moved on to the next person. After class, Lisa gathered her things and headed for the door. She overheard Professor Davidson talking to his assistant, a young woman named Miss Rodriguez. Keep an eye on that one, he said, nodding toward Lisa. She seems to have some coordination, but people like that often think they're better than they are. I've seen it before. They get overconfident and then get frustrated when they realize how much real work is involved. Miss Rodriguez glanced at Lisa. Should we move her up to the intermediate class? Professor Davidson shook his head firmly. Absolutely not. She needs to learn discipline and proper technique before anything else. Natural ability without proper training is actually harder to fix than starting from scratch. Lisa pretended not to hear as she walked past them. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the parking lot was full of puddles that reflected the streetlights. She sat in her 15-year-old Honda Civic for a few minutes before starting the engine. As she drove home to her small apartment, Lisa thought about the feeling of her fingers on the piano keys. It had been 29 years since she had touched a piano, but her hands remembered. They remembered everything. She pulled into her parking spot and climbed the stairs to her second-floor apartment. The building was old and the walls were thin, so she could hear her neighbor's television through the wall. Her apartment was small but clean, just a bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, and tiny living room with a couch she had found at a garage sale. Lisa made herself a cup of tea and sat at her kitchen table, thinking about the class. The other students seemed nice enough, though she obviously didn't fit in with their world of retirement funds and country clubs. Professor Davidson clearly had doubts about her, but that was okay. She was used to people underestimating her. What mattered was that she was finally doing it. After all these years of dreaming and saving and making excuses, she was actually taking piano lessons. She looked at the calendar on her refrigerator and counted the days until the next class. 6 days. She could hardly wait. As she got ready for bed, Lisa caught herself humming the simple melody from the finger exercise. Her fingers moved silently on her nightstand, practicing the movements even without a piano. Tomorrow she would be back at the diner at 5 in the morning, taking orders and refilling coffee cups and cleaning tables. But now she had something to look forward to, something that was just for her. She didn't know yet how dramatically her quiet piano lessons would change her life. She couldn't predict that in just a few weeks everything would be different. All she knew was that for the first time in 29 years she had touched piano keys again, and it felt like coming home. 3 weeks had passed since Lisa started the piano class, and the pattern was becoming clear. Every Thursday evening she would finish her shift at the diner, drive home to shower and change clothes, then head to the community center with hope in her heart. And every week that hope got a little smaller. Professor Davidson had a system, and Lisa was clearly at the bottom of it. While Margaret had moved on to playing simple melodies with both hands, and Robert was learning basic scales, Lisa was still stuck on the same finger exercises from week 1. Every time she completed an assignment perfectly, Professor Davidson would find something wrong with it. "Your wrist is too high," he would say, even when it wasn't. "You're rushing the tempo," he would add, even though she was keeping perfect time. "Let's have you practice this exercise for another week. Really focus on getting the fundamentals right." Lisa began to notice how differently he treated the other students. When Margaret made mistakes, Professor Davidson would smile patiently. "Don't worry, Margaret. This takes time. You're doing wonderfully for someone your age." When Robert's fingers stumbled over a simple scale, the professor was encouraging. "Excellent effort, Robert. I can see you've been practicing at home. Keep it up." But when Lisa played the same exercises flawlessly, week after week, Professor Davidson would barely nod. Sometimes he wouldn't acknowledge her playing at all. Instead, turning to help another student before she had even finished, Lisa tried not to let it bother her. She told herself that maybe she was being too sensitive, that maybe Professor Davidson was just trying to help her build a strong foundation. But it was hard to ignore the way he looked at her, like she was taking up space that belonged to someone else. Miss Rodriguez, the assistant instructor, was even worse. She was a young woman, probably in her late 20s, with perfectly styled hair and expensive clothes. She had graduated from the state university with a music degree and seemed to think that made her better than everyone else, especially Lisa. During the 4th week of class, Miss Rodriguez pulled Lisa aside after the session ended. "Lisa, can I have a word with you?" she said, her voice sweet but with an edge to it. Lisa gathered her things and walked over to where Miss Rodriguez was standing, by the piano. The other students were chatting as they packed up their music books and purses, but Lisa could feel them listening. "I've been watching your progress," Miss Rodriguez began, "and I'm a little concerned." Lisa's heart sank. "Is something wrong with my playing?" "Well, it's not about your playing exactly," Miss Rodriguez said, glancing around to make sure the other students could hear. "It's more about whether this is the right fit for you." "I don't understand." Miss Rodriguez sighed as if she was being very patient with a difficult child. "Look, I think it's wonderful that you want to learn piano. I really do. But these classes are designed for people who have the time and resources to really commit to learning properly. You work 6 days a week, right? At a restaurant?" Lisa nodded, feeling her cheeks start to burn. "I just worry that you might be setting yourself up for disappointment," Miss Rodriguez continued. "Piano requires a lot of practice time, and it can be expensive as you advance. Maybe you'd be better off with something more practical. The community center offers some great cooking classes, or there's a really popular quilting group that meets on Tuesdays." The suggestion hit Lisa like a slap. Cooking classes? As if working in a kitchen all day wasn't enough? And quilting? This is because she was working class didn't mean she couldn't appreciate music. "I'd like to continue with piano," Lisa said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. Miss Rodriguez shrugged. "Of course, that's your choice. I'm just trying to help you be realistic about your goals." As Lisa walked to her car that night, she could hear Miss Rodriguez talking to Margaret and Patricia by the main entrance. "I feel sorry for her, I really do," Miss Rodriguez was saying. "But some people just don't understand what classical music education really involves. She probably thinks she can just show up once a week and magically learn to play Chopin." The other women made sympathetic murmuring sounds. "It's not her fault," Margaret added. "She just doesn't come from that kind of background. Music education is really something you need to start young, when your family can afford proper lessons." Lisa sat in her car for a long time before starting the engine. She thought about quitting. It would be so easy to just stop coming, to spend her Thursday evenings at home watching television like she used to. The money she was spending on lessons could go toward fixing her car or maybe saving up for a better apartment. But every time she thought about giving up, she remembered the feeling of her fingers on the piano keys. Even playing those simple exercises felt like magic to her. It was the only hour of her week when she forgot about sore feet and rude customers and bills that came too fast. The next week, Professor Davidson announced that the class was going to start learning real songs instead of just exercises. Lisa felt a spark of excitement. Finally, she thought. Finally, she would get to play actual music. "We're going to begin with Mary Had a Little Lamb," Professor Davidson said. "It's a perfect piece for beginners because it only uses 3 notes and has a simple rhythm." Lisa had to bite her tongue to keep from laughing. Mary had a little lamb? She had played that song when she was 7 years old. But she nodded along with the other students and waited for her turn to try it. When Professor Davidson demonstrated the song, Lisa found herself automatically hearing the harmony that could go with it, the way the left hand could play a simple accompaniment to make it sound fuller. But she knew better than to suggest anything like that. Margaret went first, slowly picking out the melody with one finger. Professor Davidson was patient and encouraging, helping her find the right keys and count the rhythm. Robert was next. He managed to play most of the song correctly, though he had to stop and start over a few times. "Wonderful progress," Professor Davidson said. "You're really getting the hang of this." When it was Lisa's turn, she sat at the piano and played Mary Had a Little Lamb exactly as Professor Davidson had demonstrated it. Simple melody, steady rhythm, no extra flourishes. But even playing such a basic song, her natural musicality came through. The notes were perfectly even, the timing was precise, and she somehow made even this children's song sound pleasant to listen to. Professor Davidson frowned. "You played that very well," he said, and somehow he made it sound like an accusation. "Almost too well. Are you sure you haven't been practicing this song before?" "No, sir," Lisa said honestly. "I've never practiced it." Professor Davidson made a note on his clipboard. "Well, don't get ahead of yourself. Playing one simple song correctly doesn't mean you're ready for more advanced material. We'll keep working on this piece for the next few weeks. I want you to focus on really mastering the fundamentals." Lisa returned to her seat, confused and frustrated. She had played the song perfectly, exactly as he had taught them. What more did he want? Meanwhile, Patricia, who had stumbled through the song and played several wrong notes, received praise and encouragement. "Don't worry about those little mistakes," Professor Davidson told her. "You're showing real musical sensitivity. I think you're ready to try Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star next week." Lisa watched this interaction with growing disbelief. Patricia had made multiple errors, but she was being moved ahead to a new song. Lisa had played flawlessly, but she was being held back to master the fundamentals of a song she had already mastered. After class, she overheard Professor Davidson talking to Miss Rodriguez again. "I don't like it when students try to show off," he was saying. "That woman thinks she's better than she is. It's a classic case of a little bit of natural ability going to someone's head. Should we move her to a different class?" Miss Rodriguez asked. No. She needs to learn humility before anything else. The worst thing we could do is encourage her ego. She needs to understand that real musical education is about discipline and proper training, not just playing around." Lisa felt a mix of anger and sadness as she drove home that night. She was being punished for playing well. In Professor Davidson's mind, her success wasn't proof that she was ready for more challenging material. It was proof that she needed to be taken down a notch. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. While other students progressed at a normal pace, making mistakes and receiving encouragement, Lisa was held to an impossible standard. Every week she played her assigned pieces perfectly, and every week Professor Davidson found reasons to keep her at the same level. "Your posture could be better. I want you to really focus on your finger curve. Let's spend another week on this piece. I want it to be absolutely perfect." The other students began to treat her differently too. At first they had been curious about her. Now, influenced by the instructor's attitudes, they seemed to see her as someone who didn't quite belong. They would chat among themselves about their other activities, book clubs, charity events, bridge games, but the conversation would stop when Lisa approached during breaks, while everyone else gathered around the coffee table to share stories about their grandchildren or their recent vacations. Lisa would sit alone in her chair, pretending to study her music book. She began to dread Thursday evenings almost as much as she looked forward to them. The actual piano playing was still magical, but it was the 8th week of class when everything changed. Lisa arrived at the community center that Thursday evening like she always did, but something felt different the moment she walked into the music room. Professor Davidson was standing at the front with a big smile on his face, and Miss Rodriguez was holding a stack of colorful flyers. "Good evening, everyone," Professor Davidson announced as the students settled into their chairs. "I have some exciting news to share with you tonight." Lisa took her usual seat in the back corner and listened as Professor Davidson explained that the community center was having its annual fundraiser concert in 3 weeks. It was a big event that raised money for their programs, and people from all over town would attend. "This year," Professor Davidson continued, "I've decided that our beginner piano class should participate. It will be a wonderful opportunity for you to show your families and friends what you've learned." The other students looked excited. Margaret clapped her hands together, and Robert started talking about inviting his children to come watch. Patricia was already asking about what she should wear for the performance, but Lisa felt a knot forming in her stomach. She didn't want to perform in front of a crowd. She was happy just learning in the quiet of the classroom. The thought of standing up on a stage in front of strangers made her feel sick. "Now," Professor Davidson said, raising his hand to quiet the chatter, "I've been thinking about what pieces would be appropriate for each of you to perform." He went around the room, assigning songs to each student. Margaret would play Für Elise by Beethoven, a beautiful piece that Lisa knew was quite challenging for a beginner. Robert got Canon in D by Pachelbel, another impressive classical piece. Patricia was assigned Clair de Lune by Debussy, a song that Lisa remembered being incredibly difficult. Lisa was amazed. These were serious pieces of music, far more advanced than anything they had learned in class. She wondered if Professor Davidson had been teaching them privately, or if they would have 3 weeks to learn these challenging songs. Then Professor Davidson turned to her, and his smile became something else entirely, something that didn't reach his eyes. "And Lisa," he said, his voice taking on a tone that made everyone in the room pay attention, "I have something very special planned for you." Lisa's heart started beating faster. She didn't like the way he was looking at her like a cat that had cornered a mouse. "You're going to perform Chopin's Minute Waltz," Professor Davidson announced. The room went completely quiet. Lisa could hear the clock ticking on the wall and the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. She saw Margaret's mouth fall open in shock. Robert looked confused, like he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. Patricia actually gasped. Lisa didn't know much about classical music beyond what she remembered from her childhood, but even she knew that Chopin was considered one of the greatest piano composers who ever lived. The Minute Waltz wasn't something a beginner would play. It wasn't even something an intermediate student would attempt. "Professor Davidson," Margaret said carefully, "isn't that piece quite advanced?" Professor Davidson's smile grew wider. "Oh yes, it's very challenging. But I believe in pushing my students to reach their full potential. Lisa has shown some natural coordination in class, so I think this will be a good test of whether she's truly serious about learning piano." Miss Rodriguez stepped forward with a sheet of music in her hand. "Here's your piece, Lisa," she said, offering the pages with a smile that looked almost excited. "You have 3 weeks to prepare. That should be plenty of time for someone with natural ability, don't you think?" Lisa took the sheet music with trembling hands. The pages were covered with notes that looked like tiny black dots scattered across dozens of lines. There were symbols and markings she didn't recognize, tempo indications written in Italian, and finger numbers penciled in above nearly every note. She had never seen music this complicated in her life. "I don't think I can play this," Lisa said, quietly, her voice barely audible. "Nonsense," Professor Davidson said firmly. "I wouldn't assign it to you if I didn't think you could handle it. You've been telling us for weeks that you played piano as a child. This is your chance to prove it." Lisa looked up from the sheet music and saw that everyone in the room was staring at her. Some faces showed sympathy, like they felt sorry for what was obviously going to be a disaster. Others looked curious, waiting to see what would happen. But Professor Davidson and Miss Rodriguez both looked pleased with themselves, like they had just solved a problem that had been bothering them for weeks. "When is the concert?" Lisa asked, though she already dreaded the answer. 3 weeks from Saturday," Miss Rodriguez replied cheerfully. "The performance starts at 7 o'clock. We're expecting a full house, probably 200 or 300 people. Local newspaper usually covers it too." Lisa felt like she might throw up. 300 people? A newspaper? She had never performed in front of anyone in her life, let alone a crowd that size. "What if I can't learn it in time?" she asked. Professor Davidson shrugged. "Then I suppose you'll find out what real piano playing requires? This isn't like the simple exercises we do in class, Lisa. This is actual classical music. It requires dedication, discipline, and hundreds of hours of practice." The way he said it made it clear that he didn't think she was capable of any of those things. "Perhaps," Miss Rodriguez added helpfully, "you could consider playing something simpler. Mary Had a Little Lamb might be more appropriate for your current skill level." The suggestion was meant to be humiliating, and it worked. Lisa could feel her face turning red as she imagined standing on stage in front of 300 people, playing a children's song while the other students performed beautiful classical pieces. "I'll try to learn the Chopin," Lisa said, her voice stronger than she felt. Professor Davidson looked surprised, like he had expected her to give up immediately. "Are you sure? It's not too late to choose something more reasonable, I'm sure." "Very." "Well then," Professor Davidson turned to address the rest of the class, "I want everyone to understand what a big responsibility this is. You'll be representing our piano program to the entire community. People will judge the quality of our instruction based on your performances." He paused and looked directly at Lisa. "I trust that everyone will practice diligently and do their best not to embarrass themselves or this program." The message was clear. If Lisa failed, and he obviously expected her to, it would reflect poorly on everyone after class. The other students gathered around Lisa with expressions of concern and barely concealed pity. "Are you really going to try to play that piece?" Margaret asked, looking at the sheet music in Lisa's hands like it was a dangerous weapon. "It's one of the most difficult pieces in the piano repertoire," Robert added. "My grandson has been taking lessons for 5 years, and his teacher says he's not ready for Chopin yet." Patricia put a gentle hand on Lisa's shoulder. "Maybe you should talk to Professor Davidson privately. I'm sure he would understand if you wanted to switch to something easier." But Lisa could see Miss Rodriguez watching their conversation from across the room, and she caught the slight smile on the young woman's face. This whole thing had been planned. They wanted her to fail. They wanted her to embarrass herself so badly that she would quit the class and stop making them uncomfortable with her presence. "I'll be fine," Lisa said, forcing herself to smile. "It's just music, right?" As she walked to her car, Lisa heard Professor Davidson and Miss Rodriguez talking near the entrance. "Think she actually tried to perform it?" Miss Rodriguez asked. "Oh, I hope so," Professor Davidson replied with a laugh. "Can you imagine? She can barely handle Mary Had a Little Lamb, and now she thinks she can play Chopin. The whole audience will know within the first few measures that she has no business being on that stage. What if she backs out? Even better. Then everyone will see that she wasn't serious about learning piano in the first place. Either way, I think our little problem will solve itself." Lisa sat in her car in the parking lot for a long time after they went back inside. She looked at the sheet music spread across her passenger seat, all those tiny notes swimming together until her eyes filled with tears. She thought about the way Professor Davidson had smiled when he gave her this impossible assignment. She thought about Miss Rodriguez's helpful suggestion that she play a children's song instead. She thought about the other students' pitying looks and their assumption that she would fail. They all expected her to quit. They wanted her to disappear so they could go back to their comfortable world where everyone looked the same and came from the same background and nobody challenged their assumptions about who belonged in their piano class. Lisa wiped her eyes and started the engine. She had 3 weeks to learn one of the most challenging pieces in classical piano literature. 3 weeks to prepare for a performance in front of hundreds of people. 3 weeks to prove that she belonged on that stage. As she drove home through the dark streets, Lisa made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to quit. She wasn't going to switch to an easier piece. She wasn't going to give Professor Davidson and Miss Rodriguez the satisfaction of watching her fail. She was going to learn that Chopin waltz if it killed her, what they didn't. The night of the concert arrived faster than Lisa had expected. 3 weeks had passed in a blur of preparation, sleepless nights, and a determination she hadn't felt in decades. Tonight, the Riverside Community Center would be packed with people. Expecting to see her fail spectacularly, Lisa stood in the small room behind the stage that served as a backstage area, listening to the sounds of the crowd gathering in the main hall. Voices mixed together in a low hum, punctuated by the scraping of chairs and the occasional burst of laughter. Through the thin walls, she could hear families finding their seats, programs rustling, and excited conversations about the evening's performances. She looked down at her clothes and felt a familiar wave of self-doubt. While the other performers had arrived in elegant evening gowns and formal suits, Lisa wore the same outfit she had worn to her very first piano class, dark jeans, a simple black sweater, and her only pair of dress shoes that she had bought at a discount store 2 years ago. She had considered trying to find something fancier, but her budget didn't allow for formal wear, and honestly, she had spent every free moment of the past 3 weeks doing something much more important than shopping. Margaret peeked around the corner, looking stunning in a navy blue dress with pearl earrings. "Lisa, are you ready? You're up after Patricia." Lisa nodded, though her heart was beating so fast, she wondered if people in the audience would be able to hear it. "I'm ready," Margaret's expression softened with sympathy. "Listen, if you get up there and change your mind, no one would blame you. You could always just say you're not feeling well. Professor Davidson would understand." But Lisa knew that Professor Davidson wouldn't understand at all. He would be thrilled if she backed out at the last minute. It would prove everything he had believed about her from the very beginning. "Thanks, but I'm going to play," Lisa said. Quietly from the stage, she could hear Patricia finishing Claire de Lune. The audience applauded enthusiastically, and Patricia came backstage glowing with pride and relief. Professor Davidson appeared a moment later, checking his watch and looking around at the remaining performers. "All right, Lisa, you're up," he said, but his tone wasn't encouraging. It was more like someone announcing that it was time for an unpleasant medical procedure. "Remember, this is being recorded for the community center's archives, and there's a reporter from the local paper in the third row. Try to do your best." Lisa walked toward the stage entrance, but Professor Davidson caught her arm. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" he asked in a low voice. "It's not too late to switch to something simpler. I have the sheet music for Elise right here. It would be much more appropriate." Lisa looked at him for a long moment. She could see the hope in his eyes, the desperate wish that she would take his offer and save herself from what he was certain would be public humiliation. Behind him, Miss Rodriguez was watching with barely concealed excitement, like someone waiting for a car crash. "I'm playing the Chopin," Lisa said firmly. "Professor." Davidson's face hardened. "Very well. Don't say I didn't warn you." He walked out onto the stage to introduce her, and Lisa could hear his voice through the sound system. "Our next performer is Lisa Martinez, who has been with our beginner piano program for 8 weeks. Lisa works at a local restaurant and decided to pursue her dream of learning piano later in life." The way he said it made it sound like a charity case, someone the audience should feel sorry for. She'd be attempting Chopin's Minute Waltz, which is Quite an ambitious choice for someone at her level. The audience murmured, and Lisa could hear the surprise in their voices. Someone said, "Chopin?" in a tone that suggested they thought there had been a mistake. Lisa has been very determined to challenge herself. Professor Davidson continued, "So let's give her our support as she gives it her best effort." Lisa took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The lights were brighter than she had expected, and it took a moment for her eyes to adjust. When they did, she saw exactly what Miss Rodriguez had promised: rows and rows of people, filling every seat in the community center's main hall. Families with children, elderly couples, teenagers with their phones ready to record, and in the third row, a woman with a notepad who had to be the newspaper reporter. All of them were looking at her. Lisa walked to the grand piano in the center of the stage and sat down on the bench. She adjusted her posture the way she had been taught and placed her hands in her lap for a moment, looking down at the keys that had become so familiar to her over the past 3 weeks. In the audience, she could see the other piano students sitting in the front row. Margaret gave her an encouraging smile, but her eyes were full of worry. Robert looked like he was watching someone about to jump off a cliff. Patricia had her hands clasped together as if she was praying. Behind them, Lisa caught sight of Professor Davidson and Miss Rodriguez standing at the side of the hall. Professor Davidson had his arms crossed and was checking his watch again, probably wondering how long it would take for Lisa to give up and walk off the stage. Miss Rodriguez was whispering something to a well-dressed woman next to her, probably explaining how this was going to be a disaster. Lisa placed her hands over the keys and felt the familiar magic that happened every time she touched a piano. The noise of the audience faded away. The bright lights stopped bothering her. The fear that had been building in her chest for 3 weeks suddenly disappeared. This was her moment. For 29 years, she had hidden who she really was. For 29 years, she had pretended to be someone smaller, quieter, less capable than she actually was. She had served coffee and cleared tables and smiled at rude customers and never let anyone see the person she used to be. But tonight, in front of 300 people who expected her to fail, Lisa was finally ready to stop hiding. She began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Minute Waltz filled the hall, and the change in the audience was immediate. The murmuring stopped. The rustling of programs ceased. Even the children seemed to sense that something extraordinary was happening, because Lisa wasn't just playing the notes correctly. She wasn't just managing to get through a difficult piece without making mistakes. She was playing with a level of skill and artistry that belonged in a concert hall, not a community center fundraiser. Her fingers moved across the keys with impossible grace and precision. Every note was perfect, every phrase shaped with musical intelligence that spoke of years of advanced training. The difficult passages that would challenge even experienced pianists flowed from her hands like water, effortless and beautiful. But it wasn't just technical perfection. Lisa was bringing something else to the music, something that couldn't be taught in any piano class. She was playing with soul, with emotion, with the kind of deep musical understanding that comes from living through joy and heartbreak and everything in between. In the front row, Margaret's mouth had fallen open. Robert was leaning forward in his seat, his eyes wide with disbelief. Patricia had tears running down her cheeks, though she probably didn't realize it. Professor Davidson was no longer checking his watch. He was staring at the stage with an expression of complete shock, like someone watching water turn into wine. Miss Rodriguez had gone pale and was gripping the arm of the woman next to her. The newspaper reporter had stopped taking notes and was just listening, her pen forgotten in her hand. Lisa reached the middle section of the waltz, where the melody becomes softer and more lyrical. This was the part that required the most musical sensitivity, where technical skill alone wasn't enough. The performer had to understand the emotional heart of the piece and communicate it to the audience. Lisa played it like someone sharing a secret. Her touch on the keys was so delicate that the notes seemed to float in the air, each one placed with perfect timing and expression. The audience was completely silent, afraid that even breathing too loudly might break the spell. As she moved into the final section, where the waltz builds to its brilliant conclusion, Lisa's playing became more powerful without losing any of its elegance. Her hands flew over the keyboard in passages that most pianists practice for months to master, and she made them look effortless. The last notes rang out in the hushed hall, and for a moment nobody moved. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever, as if the audience was afraid that applauding might wake them up from a beautiful dream. Then someone in the back started clapping. Others joined in, and within seconds the entire hall erupted in applause unlike anything Lisa had ever heard. People were standing up, cheering, whistling, and clapping so hard their hands hurt. Lisa sat at the piano bench, looking out at the audience with tears in her eyes. She had done it. She had actually done it. After 29 years of hiding, she had finally shown the world who she really was. Professor Davidson was pushing through the crowd toward the stage, his face a mixture of confusion, embarrassment, and something that might have been anger. Miss Rodriguez was nowhere to be seen. The newspaper reporter was frantically scribbling notes, probably trying to figure out how a waitress from a local diner had just delivered one of the most extraordinary piano performances anyone in that room had ever witnessed, but Lisa barely noticed any of them. The applause was still ringing in Lisa's ears as she walked off the stage, but she could barely hear it over the sound of her own heartbeat. 29 years of hiding were over in the span of 3.5 minutes. She had played Chopin's Minute Waltz not just correctly but beautifully, masterfully, in a way that left no doubt about who she really was. Backstage, the other performers were waiting for her with expressions she had never seen before. Margaret rushed forward first, her eyes bright with tears and excitement. "Lisa, that was incredible," Margaret said, grabbing her hands. "I've never heard anything like that in my life. Where did you learn to play like that?" Before Lisa could answer, Robert appeared beside them, shaking his head in amazement. "I don't understand. You've been in beginner class with us for 2 months. We've been playing Mary Had a Little Lamb, and you just performed one of the most difficult pieces in classical piano. What's going on?" Patricia joined them, still wiping tears from her cheeks. "Lisa, you have to tell us the truth. Who are you really?" Lisa looked at their faces, confused, amazed, but no longer condescending or pitying. For the first time since she had joined the class, they were looking at her as an equal. Actually, they were looking at her like she was something extraordinary, but before she could explain anything, Professor Davidson appeared in the backstage area. His face was red, and Lisa couldn't tell if it was from embarrassment, anger, or both. Miss Rodriguez was right behind him, looking like she wanted to disappear into the floor. "I need to speak with you," Professor Davidson said to Lisa, his voice tight and controlled. Immediately, the other students stepped back, sensing the tension. Lisa followed Professor Davidson to a quiet corner of the backstage area, where he turned to face her with an expression she had never seen before. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice low but intense. "And don't give me some story about working at a diner and taking beginner piano lessons. Nobody plays Chopin like that without years of professional training." Lisa took a deep breath. She had known this moment would come, but she still wasn't sure how to explain 29 years of silence in a few sentences. "My name is Lisa Elena Martinez Yamamoto," she said quietly. "I was born in Tokyo, but I grew up mostly in New York and Los Angeles. I started playing piano when I was 4 years old." Professor Davidson's eyes widened, but he didn't interrupt. "By the time I was 10, I was performing with youth orchestras. When I was 12, I won the Van Cliburn Jr. competition. I gave my first professional recital at Carnegie Hall when I was 14. Lisa's voice was steady, but the memories brought back a mixture of joy and pain. "I studied with some of the greatest piano teachers in the world. Dmitri Petrov in Moscow, Chen Wei-Ming in Beijing, Isabella Rossi in Milan." Professor Davidson's face had gone completely white. Those were names that any serious classical musician would recognize, legendary teachers who only worked with the most gifted students. "When I was 15, I was accepted to the Juilliard School," Lisa continued. "I was supposed to start the pre-college program and then go directly into their undergraduate conservatory. I had recording contracts being discussed, concert tours being planned. Everyone said I was going to be the next great classical pianist. What happened?" Professor Davidson asked, Though his voice was barely a whisper now, Lisa's composure wavered for just a moment. My father's business collapsed when I was 16. Not just failed, completely destroyed by a partner who embezzled everything. We lost our house, our savings, everything. My mother got sick from the stress and needed expensive medical treatment. I had to choose between my music career and taking care of my family. The backstage area had gone quiet. Even the sounds from the audience in the main hall seemed muted. I moved here to take care of my mother and started working to pay for her medical bills. I've been working ever since, restaurants, cleaning services, whatever I could find. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd go back to music someday. But someday never came. My mother passed away 5 years ago, and by then, I had been away from serious piano for so long that I didn't know if I could ever come back. Professor Davidson stared at her for a long moment. But you could have gone back. You just proved that your talent is still there? Why didn't you try to restart your career? Lisa shrugged sadly. Do you know how old most classical pianists are when they start their professional careers? Teenagers, early 20s at the latest. By the time I was 30, I was already too old. And I had no connections left, no money for new recordings or publicity. The classical music world doesn't have much patience for middle-aged waitresses, even ones who used to be prodigies. Miss Rodriguez had been listening from a few feet away, and now she stepped forward with tears in her eyes. Lisa, I'm so sorry. The way we treated you, the things we said. Lisa looked at the young woman who had spent weeks suggesting she try cooking classes instead of piano. You didn't know. Nobody knew. I didn't want anyone to know. But why? Professor Davidson asked. Why hide something like that? Lisa thought about how to explain it. Because when you've lost something that was your whole identity, sometimes it's easier to pretend it never existed. It hurt too much to think about what I used to be, what I could have been. Working at the diner, living a simple life. It was safe. Nobody expected anything from me, so I couldn't disappoint anyone. She paused, looking around at the faces listening to her story. But then I started coming to your class, and every week I touched those piano keys, I remembered who I used to be. I started to miss that person. When you assigned me the Chopin piece, I thought maybe it was time to stop hiding. Professor Davidson ran his hands through his hair, looking like a man who had just discovered his entire worldview was wrong. Lisa, I don't know what to say. The way I treated you, the assumptions I made. I'm ashamed of myself. Lisa nodded but didn't say anything. She wasn't angry anymore. The performance had washed most of that away. But she wasn't ready to forgive him either. What are you going to do now? Margaret asked, appearing beside them. With Robert and Patricia close behind, Lisa hadn't really thought that far ahead. For weeks, all her energy had been focused on learning the Chopin piece and surviving the performance. Now that it was over, she wasn't sure what came next. I don't know, she said honestly. I suppose I'll go back to work on Monday. The diner doesn't run itself. But you can't just go back to that, Patricia said urgently. Not after what we just heard. You're too talented to waste your gift. Before Lisa could respond, a woman appeared in the backstage area. It was the newspaper reporter, still holding her notepad and looking slightly overwhelmed. Excuse me, the reporter said. I'm Jennifer Walsh from the Riverside Gazette. Could I have a word with you, Miss Martinez? That performance was, Well, I've been covering community events for 15 years, and I've never heard anything like that. Lisa agreed to speak with the reporter, and over the next few minutes, she found herself telling her story again. Jennifer's eyes grew wider with each detail, and Lisa could practically see the headlines forming in the woman's mind. This is going to be front-page news, Jennifer said when Lisa finished. Do you mind if I ask what you're planning to do next? Are you going to return to professional music? Lisa looked around the backstage area at Professor Davidson, who was still processing his shock, at Miss Rodriguez, who kept apologizing, at her fellow students who were looking at her like she was some kind of miracle. I think, Lisa said slowly, I'd like to teach. Professor Davidson's head snapped up. Teach? Not classical performance, Lisa clarified. That world probably wouldn't welcome me back anyway. But there are a lot of people like me out there, people who love music but think it's not for them, because they're too old, or too poor, or don't fit the right image. Maybe I could start a program for people who've been overlooked. Jennifer was scribbling frantically. Where would you teach? Lisa looked at Professor Davidson. Well, that depends on whether the community center would be interested in a different kind of piano program, one that's actually welcoming to everyone. Professor Davidson's face went through several expressions before settling on something that looked like humility. Lisa, after tonight, I think you could teach anywhere you wanted. And if you're willing to forgive an old fool who let his prejudices blind him to an extraordinary talent, I'd be honored to help you start any program you want. Miss Rodriguez stepped forward, too. I'd like to help as well, if you'll let me. I have a lot to learn about treating people with respect, regardless of their background. Lisa smiled for the first time since walking off the stage. I think that could work. 3 months later, Lisa was standing in the same music room at the Riverside Community Center, but everything was different. The folding chairs were arranged in a circle instead of rows, there was a coffee maker in the corner, and the walls were covered with pictures of students of all ages and backgrounds. Her Music for Everyone program had attracted people Professor Davidson's beginner class never would have reached. There was Tom, a 70-year-old mechanic who had always wanted to play blues piano. Maria, a single mother who cleaned offices at night and dreamed of playing the songs she heard on the radio.